So what I will do later today, when I get back to my office, is I'll post the exam. So everyone had the same exam, so you'll kind of be able to see what the original questions were. So on your Scantron, the ones that are checked are the ones that you got wrong. Okay. So anywhere you see a red check mark, that should be you got that question wrong. I put the total number that you got correct and then the total number you got wrong. So one thing that could be a little confusing is I counted the bonus question wrong, although your grade is still calculated out of 25. So for instance, even if I had like a -1 on here and a plus 25, well, you would still get 25 out of 25, right? That one question didn't count against you. So what I'm allowing you to do is every question you got wrong, you can redo it, right? So you'll have that exam. It's now not 4 answers. Hopefully you only have 3 now that you know you can choose from, right? And you've got some time, you can go back with your notes. You can use me as a resource and you can correct those problems. For every question you correct correctly, I'll give you an additional 2 points back. Right? So I think in the announcement, I put how much that could actually end up being. It turns like, what? So let's say, was it like a 70 into an 82?
72 to an 88.
72 into an 88. It was just the example numbers I gave. So it can be a pretty big jump, right? So I know sometimes these first exams are difficult, right? And I know that kind of just getting used to the terminology and how questions are written, right? So I maybe have this in my back pocket just in case the average is a little bit low. If everybody does these corrections, uses their notes, uses me as a resource, I want you to get all these points back. If everybody, every question, reworks every single question I got wrong, I think the average ends up being 78, 79, right? Which is pretty good. I mean, generally, like I said, I like to have like a 75 average. So I'm hoping that all of you take advantage of this opportunity. So it'll be due in class a week from today, right? So Monday, Tuesday is fall break, right? But we'll be meeting again next Wednesday. So I want you to bring those corrections there Wednesday. I know if you're around, could schedule a time to meet with me Monday or Tuesday. I can do Zoom meetings as well. If you have any questions or send me questions via email, I can try to guide you down the right road if you're just not quite sure on some of those corrections. Okay.
Are we just gonna do it on like a sheet of notebook paper?
Yeah, so just write it out on a sheet of notebook paper, kind of show your work. So what this doesn't look like is turning in a sheet of paper that says problem 3C, right? Because I want to see that you work out why it is C. Okay. So I need to see your work along with it. In fact, if I see your work and maybe you didn't get the question correct, as long as you provide some additional work that you kind of show that you grasp the concepts, probably pretty friendly and maybe give you like 1 out of the 2 points back. Okay, so show as much work as possible, right? To earn the full 2 points back, I need to see the correct answer and why the correct answer is what it is. So it's not just simply telling me C, problem 3C, that gets you nothing. The way you're earning these points back is providing me the reason why the correct answer is what it is. Like I said, even if you make the correction, give me a reason, and you were still a little bit off, at least if you gave me a reason, I'll still give you 1 out of those 2 points. Okay, so I know someone's going to do this, and so I'm hammering it a little bit home. But you know, if you turn this in, this is 0 points back. Right? I need to see some justification, whether or not that's a sentence or 2, whether or not that's draw a graph, right? Show me visually on a graph. Some of the equation problems, rework the equations for me, right? I need to have some support as to why the correct answer is what it is. Is that clear? Are there any questions on that? Okay with that? Okay. So like I said, if everybody does those, overall pretty good on exam. I think I understand, you know, it's a lot of material, especially for this first exam I'm throwing at you. It's a lot to remember. And I'm really concerned with you understanding things moving forward, which is the whole reason why I'm not just having you correct them. I'm making sure that, you know, this is kind of like you teaching yourself in a way, providing the reasoning why and kind of trying to look for that reason why. Hopefully this will kind of help you learn as well in the process of making these corrections.
Where are the questions?
So I'll put them up on Canvas when I get back to my office today. I couldn't put them up until I handed them back today, so I'll get that exam up there. So you'll be able to go back through and kind of rework it. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. All right. So with that, we move forward. Okay. So some of the stuff that we did is going to help us with some of the next topics that we're going to tackle. So this class builds on itself in the sense of we're using things that we've already talked about, some of the concepts, and they'll look slightly different, but we are going to kind of build on. So one thing we'll introduce as we're going into the discussion of what firms, I think I have the title, I guess I didn't put it on the title slide. We're going to transition a little bit from thinking about like consumers, right, producing market, to thinking about more of the company's decisions. Okay? So we've kind of determined how a market reaches equilibrium, why consumers and producers make the decisions that they do. But now we're going to think about it more through the lens of actual firms or companies. Okay. So one thing that we're going to be concerned with are costs, right? But one of the costs that we don't want to be concerned with, and it'll kind of pop up when we start thinking about whether or not companies should shut down, is the idea of a sunk cost. Okay? So the idea of a sunk cost is that it doesn't matter what I do from here on out, I'm going to have to pay this cost no matter what. So I'll give you a production example. So let's say I go and I buy some abandoned factory, right? I'm going to start producing, I don't know, erasers, right? So I buy this factory, I sign it, I'm locked into a year lease, right? So my cost to own this building is, I don't know, let's say it was $50,000 for the year. That cost is independent of how much I produce. I can produce 5 erasers, I can produce 5,000 erasers. My cost for that building is still $50,000, right? So the idea of a sunk cost is I've already committed to paying this, and it doesn't matter what I do moving forward. It doesn't matter how much I produce or how little I produce moving forward. This cost is what it is. Okay. So that varies a little bit from the idea of, well, hold on. So that's the idea of a sunk cost. Okay? We should ignore sunk costs. Okay? When we're making decisions, whether or not it's a person, a consumer, or a company, we should always be thinking about, I will want to do something as long as the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to, right, up to that equality point, greater than or equal to that marginal cost. Now, what doesn't get factored into these marginal costs, remember, marginal costs are the change in total cost from producing more. Right? So if I'm thinking about my marginal cost, I should be thinking about in that example where, maybe I've got my total cost here. At one unit was 100. Right? So I'm thinking about my marginal cost. Going from that first to that second unit, I increased my total cost by 20. Right? Now, with the idea of a sunk cost, right? The idea of the building, if I produce 5 or 5,000 erasers, I still have to pay whatever that sunk cost is. I've already paid it, I've already agreed to that lease. That $50,000 is spent. So moving forward, that doesn't play a role at all into my marginal cost, right? So I'm thinking about decision making, is the marginal benefit greater than the marginal cost? Those sunk costs shouldn't play a role at all. Okay? I think I've got some other example, like the idea of like there's no use crying over spilled milk, right? Once I've paid this cost, I shouldn't think about it again. I can only make better decisions kind of moving forward. So let's say this example is a little tricky, and I think I've got some other more real world examples that might help connect with some people a little bit better. So let's say you're wanting to go to a movie, the cost is, it's probably much higher than I don't movie at all. So back when I used to go to movies, it cost $10, right? So you decide to go to a movie, right? And you look in your wallet and you realize I lost $10, right? So prior to realizing this, right, this was some movie I wanted to go see, right? So maybe this is, I don't know, the new Avengers movie or whatever, whatever movie's coming out that I want to see. I was on my way to go see it, so it must have been that I thought the additional benefit I'll get from going to that movie must have been greater than or equal to that $10. Right? That's the whole reason I was going. But I then realized I don't have $10 in my wallet, or that I lost $10. Now, assuming that I have more than just the $10 I lost, right? Like I've got a bank account and I've got money in it. I've got plenty of money to still go to this movie. What should the decision be? Well, it doesn't matter if I decide to go to the movie now or I don't. That $10 is lost either way, right? That's a sunk cost. That $10 is gone, right? Whether or not I go to the movie or I don't. So when I'm thinking about the actual marginal cost, right? If I, let's say, don't go to the movie, I'm going to lose $10. Or I can kind of think about this instead of negative. I can think about it as my cost, right? Costs are kind of negative to consumers. My cost was $10 if I don't go now, because I lost that $10. That $10 is gone. If I go, well, now I lose that original, I lost that original $10, but I'm going to spend another $10 to go to that movie. Because on the margin, I still must have a marginal benefit that's greater than or equal to that $10, right? I originally decided before I knew that this additional money was lost, I was going to go to that movie. So we knew that the case had to be that the marginal benefit was greater than or equal to that marginal cost. Well, if I think about here, I'm not comparing my marginal benefit to the total cost. I'm comparing it to the marginal cost. So what's the marginal cost of going to this movie? $10, right? If I don't go, I lost the 10, so my cost is 10. If I do go, I lost the 10, plus I spend another 10 to go, right? But the marginal cost here is only $10. Right? By going, it's only adding additional 10. So here, the idea of losing the money, that's your sunk cost. Right? Knowing that you lost that money shouldn't influence your decision moving forward at all. Okay? Any questions on it? When I'm getting that there. So what if instead you lose the ticket, right? Should you go back and buy another? Well, if you don't go back and buy another, like let's assume you didn't lose the money, you got all the money that you came with, you buy the ticket, I don't know, it falls out of your back pocket on your way and you can't find it. So you lost the ticket, you essentially lost the $10, even if you decide to just go back home. So if I instead decide to stay and buy another ticket, what's my marginal cost? The same kind of idea. Losing that ticket is a sunk cost. So kind of the same idea would be like, still go to the movie. Right? So how does this apply more to like a business setting? You kind of think about it as, sometimes whether or not we decide to stay in business, we're still going to be subject to paying certain sunk costs, right? And so sometimes by continuing to operate, even though we know that maybe profits will be negative, right? Or that we might lose some money, we're going to lose less money than if we just completely shut down, right? So think about this as I might have these huge commitments, my sunk costs are $50,000. Well, if I don't produce anything, I'm definitely losing $50,000. If I stay open, maybe I can cut into that. I make $20,000 by operating and selling these erasers. Well, now my total cost there, I made $20,000 staying open. I still have that huge sunk cost of $50,000. Now I'm out $30,000, but that's a hell of a lot better than being out $50,000. So that's kind of how this idea of sunk cost can apply to the business setting. I guess some other, so this is the non-sports fans, you may hate this example, but this is a really good example that you see in practice. And you can think about this, actually, companies do this with CEOs to a degree. But a lot of times in football is going on right now, so it's relevant, right? When you spend a lot of money on a player, you give them a huge contract, right? And then they start performing very poorly, right? So let's say, I don't know, kind of my wife's a Ravens fan. So let's say Lamar gets like a $300 million contract, right? They give him this huge contract, right? And then the following year, he's averaging like 5 interceptions a game, just playing terrible, right? If they decide to stick with him, right? what's their cost? If it's fully guaranteed, which is kind of what they're talking about, that cost is gone. You're paying him 300 million, whether or not he's good or bad moving forward. So if he's throwing 5 interceptions a game, it probably makes sense to win games to maybe replace him, right? If you replace him, guess what? You still have the same $300 million cost, whether or not you played him or not, except for now you might win some games and bring some more money and bring some fans in the seat. So I'm using a hypothetical example here, but a lot of teams do this where they'll sign a player, doesn't matter what sport, you pay them this huge salary. It's pretty, a lot of guarantees involved. So you're going to pay the money no matter what. And then they're like, well, we got to keep giving him a shot. We got to keep giving him a shot. Well, no, if they prove to you that the marginal benefit of playing them is very, very low, those are sunk costs. You shouldn't be factoring those into your decision making at all. Right? But that's, I guess that's an example that might connect with some people, but not maybe not all. So, with this idea in mind of sunk costs, we then kind of move to breaking costs down into 2 groups. Right, so when we look at the actual costs that firms are paying, we're going to call them explicit and implicit. So explicit costs are like what we generally think about, like how much does it cost for the materials to make this race, right? Implicit costs are going to be what am I giving up or what am I foregoing? So these are kind of like our opportunity costs, right? So you think about this as if I've got a company and like a tool and die shop or something, and maybe I'm making a certain gear for a company, right? But in doing that, I'm not using my machinery to maybe produce doors for GM, right? So I'm not producing one good in order to produce another. What I'm giving up, right? What I could be making if I was making doors instead of gears, that's going to be an opportunity cost, right? Opportunity cost for the cost of the next best thing that we're not doing. So implicit costs are going to be these opportunity costs. Explicit, like I said, the easy way to think about those, raw materials. That's going to be the most common.
With the implicit cost, was that kind of the example that we had last before last, in which there was the person given him 47, like 100.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think I've got an example here. Then I'll hopefully make sense. Right. But yes, it's the same idea. Implicit cost, it's easier to think about. It's basically just another word for opportunity cost. It's just that we're applying these firms, and we'll often see them refer to implicit cost of a firm. So let's think about the decision to go to school or go to college. So I've stole this. I occasionally will still do some if I like them. I like this decision, right? So I think it's really relevant, especially for you guys. So let's say I decide I'm going to go to college. In that first year, what were my costs involved, right? So tuition, books, maybe I had to buy a computer, right? So all these are explicit costs, right? These are things that I had to purchase. Kind of a weird thing here. These are raw materials, right? That I need to produce it. When I produce them, I'm producing education, so it's a little bit weird, all right? But these are my explicit costs that are coming out of my wallet. You can think about it as implicit costs. They're not coming out of my wallet, right? I'm not going to have to pay them with actual money, but it's something that I'm not doing, right? Money that I could be making that I'm not because of what I've chosen to do. I've chosen to go to college, so I've gone working maybe kind of a full-time job, right? And whatever wages I could earn there. And even if you're working at the same time as you're going to college, you can think about this as, well, how much more money could I make if I could be working all the time and I'm in class or doing home? So, if we think about the decision to go to college, a lot of people talk about the cost of college is rising, which it is, like tuition and things like that. The explicit costs are rising, but also there's a really huge implicit cost to attending college, especially if you're not working while you're there, right? And if you're not even doing a part-time job, right? Because if you could be working a full-time job or get into a trade, you guys are here, so I'm not trying to discourage you from being here. All right, potentially, that salary could be as high as $50,000 by the time you get to that 4th year, right? So there's also a huge implicit cost pursuing education as well. So, if we're just looking at the explicit costs, we're like, oh, it's not that bad, $10,000. But if you look at how much money you're giving up, that $35,000, well, now the total cost is significantly higher. Okay. Any questions on this? That make Makes sense. Okay. So if we then, so we've talked a little bit about these costs, kind of set things up. If I think about a firm's decision, what does ultimately a firm or a company want to do? Make money, right? More specifically, not just make more money. They want to be making more money than the additional amount they're spending, right? So the real objective is to what we call the maximize profits, right? So if we're thinking about what are profits, and I'll often, I don't know if I have this in the slide. I'll often write profits, and then kind of way you see this in a book or any economics kind of literature. Profits, we use the notation of using this pi, right? There's this number pi, 3 point, whatever, 412, whatever it is. Right? But that's how we're going to represent profits, just in shorthand, so I don't have to write it out every single time. And all it's going to be is total revenue, which is how much money I make, minus what are my total costs, right? So that's what I want to maximize, right? Because I can always make more money if I just spend more money, but that doesn't help, you know, if I spend $500,000 to make 300, well, what good was that, right? So what they really care about is profits. Now, the problem is we've got two different types of profits. So all you accountants, right, you look at these the books and you calculate profits. But all you're seeing in that ledger are what? All you see are but all you're seeing is the things that you actually paid money for, right? All you see are the explicit costs. When we're thinking about accounting profits, a lot of the times they might look pretty good, right? Maybe it looks like the company's netting $100,000, $200,000 this year, right? But that's only taken into account everything on the ledger, all these explicit costs. If we look at, well, what could this company be doing, right? If instead of producing, my example of gears, like maybe these gears are really low cost, and producing doors for GM, GM might pay me hundreds of dollars per door. Well, I'm foregoing a lot then by not producing another good. So if instead of looking at just accounting profits, which are just how much money was made minus the explicit costs, for economic profits, we think about these economic costs include not only our explicit, but also the implicit costs, right? So if I'm thinking about kind of the comparison here, what's going to always be true about accounting profits relative to economic profits? So both of them will start out with total revenue, right? But here, we're just taking out our explicit costs. When we're calculating economic profits, we're still going to take out these explicit costs, but economic cost refers to kind of the total of the two things, both explicit and implicit costs. So what's going to be true about accounting profits relative to economic profits? Accounting profits will always be, I mean, these are the exact same. So what's the only difference when we're calculating economic profits? We're also subtracting out additional costs. So economic profits are always going to be more accurate, looking more for less, right? Because I'm factoring in these additional costs that I wasn't over here. So the accounting profits, things might look real nice and rosy sometimes if the implicit costs are really, really large, right? Now, if the implicit costs are zero, they're the same thing, right? But often in the real world, we don't have zero implicit costs, right? We're always giving up doing something else. Okay. So we want to maximize kind of economic profit. So I think I have an example of this. It's kind of a stupid example, but hopefully it kind of makes the point. So let's say we have this person states and they want to open a restaurant, right? And they're trying to make the decision whether or not they should, right? So we look at all the explicit costs here. We look at how much revenue they can make. So, we've got $500,000 of revenue. I've got to pay $20,000 to my workers, $50,000 for the kind of raw food inputs, et cetera, et cetera. So I add up all these, right? And I think, okay, add up my explicit cost here, 100 plus 200 plus 50 plus 50,000. My total cost may be 400,000. And I can make 500. So I'll be making positive profit here, right? $100,000 in profit. So she should open the business, right? I mean, as long as she is okay, you know, she might have had a threshold. Maybe she wanted to make at least 50,000. Well, she's over that, right? She can make $100,000 starting this restaurant. But what if Stacy is like a world-renowned chef, right? And there's some restaurant who'd be willing to pay her, I don't know, $250,000 or something outrageous, right? Well, in owning your own restaurant, she's not working at this other restaurant, she's working at her own. So she's giving up that huge potential salary of working at this, you know, I don't know, Michelin restaurant or whatever it is. Right, so we haven't factored that in. So if we then instead, right, so maybe not 250, 150,000, sorry, I got my number a little bit wrong. All right, so maybe a personal chef or working in another restaurant. Well, now if we factor that additional implicit cost in, well, now owning your own restaurant, she's actually making $50,000 less than if she just decided to not open the restaurant and go work as a personal chef from somewhere else. That makes sense. Any questions on that? So if she opened that restaurant, we said originally her accounting profits would be $100,000. But she'd be giving up making $150,000 somewhere else. So when choosing to open, you know, work at that restaurant, she's actually going to be a little bit, she's actually going to be making $50,000 less, right? 100 as opposed to 150,000. So once we factor in what she's giving up, the opportunity cost, we actually see that opening the restaurant is going to provide negative profits, economic profits. Sorry, I should clarify that.
So you can only, like, figure out economic profits if you have a situation like this? Like, if it's just, like, you can't just figure out accounting and economic, you have to have.
Yeah, so economic profits are going to be a lot more difficult to calculate, right? That's why, like, watch my words here. Accountants like things like cut and dry, right? And then they want, that's why we're using all explicit costs, because it can be that implicit costs can be have to be estimates, right? So even in this example, I don't actually know, unless there's an offer on the table, I don't know what her salary could be or highest salary could be at another place or another restaurant or as a personal chef. But I could look at what the industry average is, right, based off of her experience and whatever, and come up with somewhat of an estimate of what I think her salary could be somewhere else. In the examples that I'll give you, yeah, you would be given something like she's got an offer of this, right? She knows that she could go out and make this somewhere else. Right? Give you another. So this is. I'll give you another example. So a lot of people, when they, so in academia, like a lot of your professors should all tell them thank you, right? Because in a lot of professions, especially within the business setting, by being a professor here, you're probably making less money than if you took a job out in the private sector, right? So if you're just looking at whatever what your salary or wages are, yeah, everything looks good, right? You're making pretty good money, right? But if you're in finance, you've got a PhD, you can be making crazy money for some of these private companies, right? And so by working here at the university, you're foregoing a lot of those higher salaries, right? So that's not much of a firm decision. That isn't a kind of personal decision there. But you can think about, again, some of these finance guys I went to graduate school with, like, they left making ungodly amounts of money for some of these huge private firms. I'm not a finance guy, I chose the wrong path, I guess, but you know, especially finance, some of these other fields, you're just foregoing so much that what ends up happening is a lot of people that, instead of deciding to be a professor of finance, the money is way too enticing, right? Unless you have a personal preference to be a professor, you're probably, if you just care about money, you're going to take the private sector jobs. What ends up happening? A lot of your, like, the better people leave the private sector, you don't have as many people there kind of willing to kind of enter into academia, so to speak. It's a little bit of a different set, but it's just different ways to think about this, right? So it's really, what are you foregoing? Anything else I wanted to say? Therefore, do not run. Yeah, so really tough. Any other questions on this idea of kind of factoring in your implicit costs? But yeah, it's a good point. It's much more difficult to measure the implicit cost than it is explicit costs. All right. I'll give you a break on this today. We'll kind of walk through these. I'll definitely be using iClickers on Friday. Make sure that I don't have people. Maybe provide you additional incentive to not take off early for fall break. Well, let's think about if we had some office space and the rent just increased by $500 a month. What would the effect be on the accounting and economic profit if you're renting the space, right? So we're kind of thinking about changes here, so it's a little bit trickier. But the space I'm renting goes up to $500 a month. And let's say we're calculating profits on a monthly basis, right? How much does accounting profits go down? Well, there's an additional $500 on spending, so accounting profits are going to fall by $500 a month. How much are economic profits going to fall? Well, I'm spending money on the building, right? So I'm spending an additional $500 in rent. So we're going to see that both of them should fall by $500 a month, right? And that's pretty easy. If something impacts explicit costs, it's going to impact accounting and economic profits exactly the same. Okay. So it gets a little bit trickier. Let's think about if we had this example. So it's the same setup, right? So I've got this office space that, for whatever reason, the market condition can now be rented for $500 more than what it could have been. So I'm thinking about my accounting profits here. So pi will always be used. Pi is just, I'm using it instead of writing this every single time. Okay, just to save myself a little time. So if I own that office space and I now could rent it for $500 more a month, what's happened to accounting profits? Nothing. It's not a cost. If I own the building, nothing's changed. Doesn't matter if I could rent it for $1,000 or $5,000. Doesn't impact my costs, and it doesn't impact my revenues. So kind of here you think about, I guess, the change is zero. And then there's no change at all. But for my for my economic profits, by now using my office space, if I could have now rented it to somebody else for an additional $500, well, I now have this thing that I'm foregoing. I'm not renting it to somebody else. So my implicit costs have actually gone up by 500 if I own the building. So it's kind of this weird scenario where if I didn't own the building and I just had to pay the rent, my economic and my accounting profits would both be hurt by $500. If I own the building and decide to continue to use it, accounting profits won't show up that I lost anything. But my economic profits will capture the fact that, yeah, actually continue to operate in this space, I'm foregoing making $500 from somebody else. Also, because because I now own the building. So that's the difference between these two questions. When I'm renting it, I don't own it. Well, those are explicit costs for me that I have to pay the rent. When I own the building, those aren't explicit costs. Those are implicit costs. That's what I'm foregoing by not renting it to somebody else. So there we get what? Accounting profits don't change. The economic profits will fall by 500. What do we say to the sunk cost fallacy? Not today. I need Game of Thrones fans. So the idea is we don't want to fall victim to sunk cost, and we also want to make sure that we're factoring in these implicit or these opportunity costs when we're calculating profits as well. All right, where are we at in time here? So, excuse me, we're going to have a couple different terms that we start using, and they're a little bit vague at first, but hopefully if you work in more examples, you'll see the vagueness and the reason for it, right? So we're gonna have the long run and the short run, right? So in the long run, right, what is the line? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? What is the short run? 1 month? Is it 1 day? There's not a hard and fast answer, right? In fact, it's gonna vary from every situation we're looking at. So the real difference is that in the long run, right, we can change every factor of production. So in the long run, it has to be enough time that I can change anything that's involved in my production process. In the short run, it means I can't change some things or that some things are fixed, right? In the short run, I don't have enough time to change certain factors of production. Right? So in the short run, a lot of the times we can change, the thing we can always change is labor. I can hire and fire people pretty quick, right? And so we usually think about labor that I need to produce things. That's pretty variable, even in the short run. I can change that no matter what the time frame window. When we go back to thinking about, I'm running a huge factory, and even if I own the space, right? I own some I've driven across Indiana enough that you get in some of these highways, like these massive like distribution centers and these massive buildings and these small towns. All of a sudden, you'll see one where, yet if I want to build an entire new production facility, that can't happen tomorrow. That's going to take a long time to build, right? Even if I make the decision to build it, I'm not going to have that for another couple of years sometimes, right? Depending on exactly what, the scale I'm talking about, right? So in the short run, things like, well, what we call it land, but essentially like your operating spaces, that might be able to change that, right? Now, in 20 years, over 20 years, you could definitely change, you could move to a different building, right? Or build a new production facility. But in the short run, you may not be able to change some of those things. Okay. So in the long run, things actually become a little bit easier. The problem is we're trying to think about day-to-day decision-making processes of these firms. So we're going to first start with focusing on the short run. And given that we have some things that are fixed, I can't just upgrade my building overnight, right, to what I want it to be. I can't just install, some new machinery in my production process right away, right? And even labor, right? Especially the more specialized labor gets, right? If I'm trying to find, a highly productive manager of my production facility, maybe that can't happen, or maybe that takes a month or two, right? So even labor sometimes can be a little bit fixed in the short run, right? So we'll focus on the short run, think about, okay, there's some things that are fixed, there's some things that aren't. Right? When you think about my production decision, the amount of money that I'm going to have to spend on whatever the material is that I was using for erasers depends on how many erasers I'm going to make. So that's variable, right? If I make 50,000, I'm going to have to spend a lot more on the raw materials than if I only make 5. So the idea is we're probably going to be focusing on the short run for a little bit here. Okay? So we're going to think about starting to think about how much is produced based off of things that we've chosen in the company. Okay? So how much is going to be produced, we're going to call this production function, right? So given all the inputs we're using, we've got 50 workers, we've got 300 tons of steel, et cetera, how much or what's the total quantity I can produce? And there'll be some function that tells me that. And we're not going to get too crazy with functions, anything, we just keep it linear. But, in a real world setting, these production functions that can exist, they get pretty complicated the more inputs we have. So a lot of times we'll show this on a graph, or on a table, that as we choose to kind of increase our inputs, increase the number of workers, increase the amount of raw materials we purchase, we should be able to produce more, right? But how much more is ultimately going to be what we want to know. So I kind of have this example starting out. I'm kind of thinking about a Chipotle, and you've got capital, you've got the building you're in. Those are pretty fixed in the short run, but you can decide how many workers that you want to have pretty quickly. Right? You can change the number of workers that you have working in the short run, right? Even day to day. So that's gonna be the kind of example we'll kind of start out with. So let's think about, maybe initially, well. I'll set up the next class. I'll start here. I'm gonna make a point. So if I hire 0 workers, how many burritos can I sell? 0. Right? I have no one's working in the store. Right? If I then get 1 person, maybe I don't know, in a given day, this might be a little bit far fetched, but maybe they can make 1,000 in a day. I don't know exactly how many sales you can make. Well, if I've got 1 person, I mean, assuming that we have them at a control, right? Think about any other like or Moe's or any other like restaurant. You go there, tell them all the stuff that you want, right? And they ring you up at the end. So if I've got 1 person and there's 10 people sitting in line, 1 worker, they walk down with 1 person, put the beans, put the steak, whatever we want. And then they have to ring you up again, give you a receipt, walk all the way back down, right? Start with the next person. So when I hire 2 workers, right, it's not that I'm probably going to see that the total number of deals goes from 1,000 to 2,000, right? Because now they can specialize in it. One of them can just stay on the register while the other one just kind of takes care of the food. So maybe I see that kind of total production will increase. And I think the example I gave here only goes up by 800. But I could see a situation. So I'm thinking about kind of number of workers here. What the marginal. I think about marginal production. So maybe the total quantity, right, is 0,000. Let's say maybe it's 22. What can sometimes happen, I think the example that I had set up here, I was going to walk through kind of think about adding more and more workers. But you kind of notice the jumps that I'm seeing. Each additional worker, the first one brought an additional 1,000 burritos. The second, only an additional 800. The third, only an additional 600, right? The change in total production was kind of getting smaller and smaller. But what can happen is that because of this idea that if I have 2 people working, one of them can specialize in the register, one of them can specialize in just kind of the food process line, that maybe for my marginal productions, that second worker, I actually get marginal production increase. Now, that's possible when I'm looking at a small number of workers and I've got specialization. I think I'll mention this stuff on the slide for it. But the idea is, as I start adding more workers, in this Chipotle example, I like kind of get an idea. You know, maybe I get to that 5th worker, they're only allowing me to make another additional 200. I bring in that 6th worker, and they're just getting in the way, right? There's a point where if I had 10 workers working behind the counter, and they're all just getting each other, they actually might not be able to sell as many as if I only had 5 workers, right? So there could be a point, right? The additional production of my workers, it's going to be getting smaller and smaller. And technically, eventually, by people standing around, could actually end up being negative. Right? Now, we never see that in practice because firms don't hire out to that. In fact, if my workers are becoming less and less productive here, I have to pay them all the same minimum wage. At some point, I'm going to decide to keep working. So we'll kind of talk about that in this class. The additional production that a worker has versus what the additional cost of hiring. Okay. So you didn't get your exam at the beginning. I've still got a couple of them up here. Make those corrections. You're not due until next Wednesday in class. So you can bring a physical copy of those to class. And then I will try to get those turned around as quickly as possible today. So I will be there tomorrow from 2 to 4.